All right, so in the previous section, we talked about how states in Europe were consolidating. Now we're going to talk about what type of path they took to consolidate. There are basically two. The first was absolutism, and the second was constitutionalism. In absolutism, such places such as France and Russia, there was a complete taking over or a complete envelopment of power by one hereditary ruler. This ruler ruled by something called divine right, which meant that he didn't have to answer to his subjects. He was responsible only to God and therefore didn't have to deal with elections and was extremely independent of that. There was really no representation of the people, even though there was nobility within these governments. The place who did this best, in quotation marks, was France. You can see it with Louis XIV, who ruled from his magnificent palace at Versailles, outside of Paris, which was originally a hunting shack, with few political, legal, or social, or religious obstacles to his authority. Most European leaders, with varying degrees of success, attempted to copy his form of absolutism. Russia, under the influence of Tsar Peter the Great, attempted to reform and modernize according to Western models. So we can look at him as really a Western copycat. One famous picture is of him cutting off everybody's beards, their Russian beards. He really desired to be European, modeled St. Petersburg after Western cities architecturally and in terms of planning. He wanted Russia to be more like the West, kind of to catch up. Though Catherine the Great, the second, carried out many of Peter's reforms and even dabbled with the notion of representative government as the Duma, she considered herself to be, after all, an enlightened ruler. The end result was really a strengthening of the absolutist state in Russia. Spain also had an absolutist government. Now we're going to move to constitutionalism, but we're going to look at it on another slide, not on this slide. First, I want to show you a picture of Louis XIV. You can see his fleur de lis, his beautiful Siberian fur, his crazy hair, and his high heels, brought to Europe by Catherine de' Medici. And this guy over here is Peter the Great of Russia, looking very Western, I might say. One of the interesting things to point out here is that these people do not look like, or excuse me, at least in Louis's case, like military conquerors anymore. They look regal, like kings. Peter may be a little bit more like a military conqueror. This is the Palace of Versailles. We'll talk a little bit about Versailles in class. And its many, many fountains, although no showers or toilets. And now we're going to take a look at constitutionalism. In constitutionalism, there is a strict rule and role for written laws. There are limited elections by a few people to get representation, usually by the nobility, aka the House of Lords, and so there are checks and balances on the king's power. England followed this path. This started in the Middle Ages with the Magna Carta that basically tied the king's power to the lords. But England eventually, after King Henry VIII, after the Elizabethan era, entered a civil war. This war was between the Protestants and the and the Catholics, well, and other groups as well, and the Anglicans too. It ended up in an establishment of the Puritan Republic, with the Roundheads taking over. Oliver Cromwell was involved in this. Unfortunately, that really wasn't what people liked either. This was a strict republic where stern laws were followed. It was Puritan, right? So Puritans came to the Americas so they could practice their religion more freely. Not everybody wanted to be a Puritan in England at this time. And so the lords got in cahoots with a king from across the pond, and they ended up bringing him over in the Glorious Revolution. It was bloodless, which meant that the king owed the House of Lords for his power. Haha, no divine right. He had to answer to his constituents, or to his lords. So individual rights were a big part of this, and representative bodies. The Netherlands, which had been under the thumb of Spain because they were part of the Habsburg possessions, also had a war of independence. They fought the Spanish trying to gain independence. It was an incredibly difficult war, and it was fought over many years, but eventually they did gain independence and had a kind of constitution as well, and a representative body. There's a really good movie called The Mill and the Cross, which is about this struggle for independence and the harsh thumb of the Spanish, because there were so many Protestants in the Netherlands. The Spanish Inquisition was happened there. So this is the Netherlands. This is William of Orange. All right, so this is William of Orange, like I was saying, also known as William the Silent, and he was one of the main leaders of the 80-year revolution in the Netherlands against the Spanish, and the end result of this was independence in the 1600s, 1638, I believe. Okay, the last thing we get to talk about with this chapter is changes in economics. We've talked about changes in religion, we've talked about changes in politics, and now we're going to talk about changes in economics and also social changes that came about because of this. The development of capitalism was fueled by an expanding population and economy, and it also transformed European society in these formative centuries. Better nutrition and a decline in deaths caused by epidemic diseases led to a population explosion. Again, getting back to that Columbian exchange. This explosion from 81 to 180 million in Europe from 1500 to 1800. Capitalism, an economic system that tied the flexibility of the free market to success, emerged in these centuries. There had to be more trade within this free market, and there was more of a focus on wealth. There was also a defining of wealth in a different term as well. Wealth had always meant holding a lot of land, and that doesn't stop, that starts to shift. It doesn't change but completely, but it starts to shift. Although the desire to acquire wealth was hardly a new phenomenon, the merchants of early modern Europe made use of innovations in transportation and communication to alter their society at a much greater extent. The development of banks and joint stock companies facilitated the growth of businesses and trade, using things like credit to have huge business ventures. Excuse me. Adam Smith wrote a book about this called The Wealth of Nations, where he advocated for the free market. Now, our economy today is a hybrid of capitalism. In Adam Smith's world, he wanted there to be a completely free market so that businesses could control everything with supply and demand. Now, one of the effects of this capitalism, this growing capitalism, was that merchants avoided the control and eventually reduced the power of guilds. The way they did this was by implementing the putting out system. The putting out system moved production from guilds where there was quality and quantity control to, guess what, farmers. You start to see more of a mechanization and a a piece by piece process of creating stuff. Basically, before there are factories, there is this putting out system where a merchant would go from home to home, and each home would be responsible for producing a different part of, let's say, a garment, like the sleeves or the the waist or the buttons and stuff like that. Um, this had really disastrous effects on farmers in the country because they were constantly working. They no longer had really a break in the winter. Um, but capitalism was very much supported and continues to be very supported. And that's where we're going to stop for this segment, the last segment of this PowerPoint, just to show you the huge increase of people moving to cities. Here we have, I guess, mainly look at 1500 and then 1650. Just a huge influx of people moving to these different cities. And that's the end. You can see now the social, the economic, the political, and religious changes that Europe was going through.